Welcome back to the Ultimate Cleveland Sports Show. I love, anytime I talk about the 95 Indians, it makes me wildly happy and wildly sad because what could have been. I think it's the best team that did not win a World Series. And the irony of that is what stood in the way of that was the other great team that had a dynasty like we had not seen throughout the 90s, particularly when it came to pitchers. Yeah. Smoltz, Glavine, they were unbelievable. And they're the team that stood in the way of us winning ours. As they're in to celebrate 30 years, before we get to the 25 Guardians and what's at stake for them this weekend, how is that 95 team remembered for you guys?
The best offensive lineup I've ever seen in my lifetime. And the pitching is underrated because the offense gets so much of the credit. The pitching was excellent.
Led the AL in ERA.
Dennis Martinez, Oral Hershiser, Charles Nagy. It was a phenomenal team. It was a renaissance. I guess, how do I remember the 95 team? It brought baseball back to Cleveland in a big way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jacobs Field opened the year before, and it's a shame. Who knows how that season would have went had there not been the lockout. But for a team to emerge from the depths of 40 years of irrelevance to win 100 games in a strike-shortened year, there was 144 games. They won 100 of them. I've always loved baseball. Baseball was always my first passion, but that team brought the city alive, and we saw it. They're going on this big run. We lose the Browns almost at the exact same time, and that 95 season really is what allowed the Indians to carry the town for 5-6 years through that deficit where there were no Browns. You couldn't get a ticket in this town to an Indians game.
You couldn't.
It was unbelievable.
They sold out, what, 435 consecutive games? I mean, that's like basically the equivalent of, I think, 7 seasons.
And this is before you could go on your phone and click 2 buttons and get tickets.
Sure.
You had to stand in line at Ticketmaster. You had to call, and it was ringing busy. You'd spend hours trying to buy 2 tickets to an Indians game.
I remember those years.
And the Browns weren't gone for 6 years.
No, but, 96, 97, 98, those were all the Indians dominated the market all those years.
Obviously, I have the outside perspective not being here at the time. And as a kid who loved baseball, was obsessed with baseball, tried to get as much access to baseball, watching This Week in Baseball, of course, or the George Michael Sports Machine, anything I could get my hands on with baseball. As a young kid, right, in the late 70s, early 80s, it really throughout the 80s, I never really thought about the Indians because they were irrelevant.
Yep.
They were completely irrelevant in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And
they lost 100 games most seasons.
The only time I ever thought about the Indians as a kid was the big trade in '84 where the Cubs got Sutcliffe and Joe Carter went to the Indians. That was the only time I ever thought about the Indians. And so as a big baseball fan, and by the 90s you had more access to watching games and stuff.
Sure.
I loved watching those Indians teams, and long before I had any clue I was going to end up in Cleveland, I wanted them to win. Yeah. The Cubs weren't any good then.
Yeah.
I hated the Yankees, so I would always root for the Indians against the Yankees every time. I was certainly in the minority in New York, although maybe not really, because most Met fans, they hate the Yankees.
Anybody
too.
But the Yankees.
Yeah. So there was they were a fun, obviously I didn't get to see them every day like you guys did, but from an outside perspective, a non-biased perspective, I remember when I get the chance to see them, and I'd be like, my God, this is ridiculous.
Yep. Yeah.
How did they get all these good players? They sucked for 40 years.
Yeah.
And now they got all these great players.
Yeah, and the formula that they used, and I mentioned earlier in the YouTube show, Dan O'Dowd had a lot to do with that.
Yeah.
John Hart gets most of the credit
Danny
for
was the farm director, right?
He was.
Yeah.
What they did
Neil Huntington was part of that, too.
They leaned into guys that were early in their contracts and gave them all extensions. And so to those players, and this was before the Boris era really took hold, where they weren't really, today, all those guys would say, nah, I'm going to roll the dice on myself and get big money.
Yeah.
Back then, you're offering Carlos Baerga, Manny Ramirez, Jim Thome, Albert Bell. You're offering these guys when they're nobodies, when they're up and coming. You're offering them stability, life-changing money. They're like, I'll sign.
Yeah.
And they got the whole core of that group to do that. And when they did, it made John Hart and Dan O'Dowd look like geniuses, because not only did they extend those offers, but they correctly chose the guys to give the offers to.
Yeah.
You think that one or two of the Thome, Ramirez, Bell, by ergo, one of those guys is going to flop, and it's going to be a waste of money. But if you hit on 2 of those 4, you're in. They hit on all of them, and it was a great strategy. We've seen that since duplicated by a lot of organizations. You can't do it as well today because, like I said, Quan is a guy that would be deserving of a long-term extension, but he's like, nah, I'm going to see how this plays out. I'm going to bet on myself.
Of all those great Indians hitters that are not in the Hall of Fame, and there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
Who do you think most deserves to be in there?
Well, I think, that's a different answer. Bell most deserves it, or Manning.
Manning.
Yeah.
For me, it's Manning.
But I think Lofton's the guy that's going to get in.
Okay. See, I think Lofton, it was a disgrace what they did to him on the ballot.
Completely agree with you.
Not only does Lofton have the numbers to match the other guys of his type of player, the Tim Raines, those type of guys. He was, and this is long before I was connected to Cleveland, he was the first player I thought of, maybe along with Derek Jeter, that I really noticed, where I was like, this guy's a winning player. Because after he left the Indians,
it was like Ricky Henderson.
Late in his career, he'd bounce around. Right,
everywhere
Ricky Henderson
went,
too.
They made the playoffs.
He would everywhere. I remember the Cubs got him one year in the 2000s. I don't remember what year it was now at this point. And I was like, I remember getting him. I said to my friend, "Oh, the Cubs are going to the playoffs this year." They got Kenny Lofton, and they did.
He was
such a winning player. There was something to it.
Without the power.
Yeah.
But he stole bases. He
Great
flashed
defense.
all kinds of leather in center field. It wasn't just the catches he made. He covered so much ground. You know, Manny was a young corner outfielder. Wasn't great defensively, but Kenny hit a lot of his deficiencies. Kenny's teams made the playoffs. Go look at the teams he played for and the percentage of years that he was in the playoffs. It's just like Ricky Henderson. It's a travesty that he's not in. We've got a piece running today at 5 o'clock.
Excuse me, Jay, we've got a little bit of breaking news here.
Okay, throw it out.
Are you guys familiar with Francis Romero?
Francis Romero.
He's a member of the Baseball Writers Association.
Yes, he covers the Red Sox, I believe.
He just tweeted out, sources say Cleveland Guardians right-handers Luis Ortiz and Emmanuel Clase will remain on the restricted list and administrative leave, respectively, through the end of the 2025 season.
Well, I expected that to come. The deadline is
this
Sunday.
weekend. And
they don't do business on Saturday and Sunday.
Right.
So I expected that today would be the announcement. One of 2 things was going to happen, and I thought this was highly unlikely. They're either going to reinstate or they're going to suspend them indefinitely through the end of the season. And that's what we have.
And now it'll be a big story in the offseason as to whether these guys ever get to play again.
And the bad thing about that is now it's going to drag. It could drag out for months and months. You know, we thought we had a finish line of July 31st with Ortiz. Then they moved the goalpost to August 31st. I guess let's respond to that. To me, my first reaction is there's no real smoking gun yet. If they had it, they would execute it.
Then how are they suspended if they don't
think it's all on supposition, Bull. It's all on circumstantial evidence. I told you I talked to somebody in the legal community who said this is basically, and it's not, you hate to compare anything to a murder case. Nobody died here. But in a murder case, if you have no weapon and no body, good luck. I mean, you don't even know that the person has been murdered. And now you're trying to convict someone of something you don't even know happened. It's the same thing here. There is so much smoke. There is so much circumstantial. We've all seen the videos of the pitches. What they're lacking right now is a piece of hard evidence, phone communications, things of that nature that would completely nail these guys on these offenses.
I wonder, it's going to be interesting. Like, let's say they do get reinstated. Like, that seems like good news. I'd rather have those guys on the roster.
I would too.
But if the players, especially their leader, Jose Ramirez, if he believes they did it, what's that going to be like in the locker room?
It's a good question.
Because you
but
know,
it's not like they were throwing games. They were throwing away one pitch of an at-bat.
But you know what, Jay? I mean, one pitch could make the difference.
I know.
And maybe if Clase hadn't been suspended, maybe if Ortiz hadn't been suspended, they'd win more games.
That's the bigger issue.
And if I'm Jose, I'm pissed.
It calls in the integrity of the rest. How can you trust them? How can you trade them? They were going to trade Clase.
Yeah, well, now they've got no value.
No.
Even if they're reinstated.
Trade for him now?
Nobody. Nobody. Although teams love to win, and they're blinded by closers that are lights out.
You may be able to trade them, but you're going to get a fraction of the value.
So the smart play would be to keep them and roll the dice. But that's a great point, Bull. The clubhouse is always going to look at these guys
be interesting to
with
see.
the side eye. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back,